At 10:30 a.m. on August 18, 1976, under the thick, humid sky of the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a small team of U.S. Army officers and South Korean personnel walked toward a poplar tree that stood like a silent sentinel inside the Joint Security Area at Panmunjom, completely unaware that within minutes they would ignite one of the most dangerous standoffs of the Cold War, a moment so volatile it nearly triggered a second Korean War and brought the world closer to nuclear escalation than most people realize. The mission was simple, routine even. Cut down a poplar tree whose branches blocked the line of sight between two United Nations checkpoints. But nothing inside the DMZ was ever truly routine, because this 2.5-mile wide strip of land was not just a boundary. It was the most militarized, paranoid, emotionally unstable border on Earth, a place where every gesture, every movement, every misunderstood expression could escalate into a firefight, and both sides knew it. The American team that morning was led by Captain Arthur Bonifas and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, accompanied by a group of South Korean workers and a handful of unarmed U.S. and ROK soldiers, because weapons were forbidden in this part of the DMZ under the fragile, hyper-technical armistice rules, and the mission report simply read, "routine tree trimming." But on the opposite side, North Korean soldiers watched with growing hostility. The tree sat in a zone both sides claimed symbolic ownership over, and its branches had become a stupid yet deadly point of pride for the North, because Kim Il-sung's regime treated every inch of the DMZ as sacred ground soaked with anti-imperialist struggle. And the moment the Americans approached that tree, the North Korean Guard detail began alerting their superiors. Within minutes, around 15 North Korean soldiers, known as the KPA Special Unit, emerged and surrounded the Americans while shouting aggressively that the tree was Kim Il-sung's personal property, and trimming it was forbidden. Bonifas, tired of North Korean theatrics, calmly ordered the work to continue. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The North Korean commander, Senior Lieutenant Pak Chol, nicknamed Lieutenant Bulldog, suddenly shouted, "Kill the bastards!" And the KPA troops, armed with axes, clubs, and pipes, rushed forward in a chaotic frenzy. The Americans, unarmed and bound by armistice rules, had no chance. Bonifas was struck from behind and beaten to death without ever raising his arms, while Barrett tried to escape by running downhill, but was hunted through a trench, cornered, and butchered with axes until he collapsed. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but when it ended, 2 Americans were dead, and several South Koreans were severely injured. The North Koreans left the scene in triumph, dragging their blood-stained axes as trophies, while U.S. and ROK soldiers stood in stunned silence, realizing instantly what this meant. Washington and Pyongyang were now on a collision course, and the next few days could decide whether the Korean peninsula would erupt into full-scale war. The news hit the White House like a thunderclap. President Gerald Ford was briefed immediately, and intelligence analysts warned him that North Korea would interpret any weakness as permission to escalate. South Korea demanded retaliation, U.S. generals demanded military action, and the State Department demanded caution. The stakes were monumental. Any response risked provoking China or the Soviet Union, both of whom were treaty-bound to support North Korea. The Pentagon quickly drafted plans for airstrikes against North Korean barracks, artillery positions, and major command posts. Another group of generals pushed for armored incursions across the DMZ. Others told Ford the United States needed to demonstrate overwhelming force without triggering total war. And while these debates raged, something else happened. The world's intelligence services began looking for deeper meaning behind the incident. questioning whether the attack was spontaneous or orchestrated by Kim Il-sung to test American resolve during a moment of U.S. political weakness following the aftermath of Watergate and the fall of Vietnam. CIA analysts found signs that the attack may have been pre-planned, noting that the North Korean soldiers arrived unusually fast, unusually armed, and unusually organized. Intercepted communications suggested Pyongyang was monitoring the UN Work Party before they even approached the tree. Whether it was a deliberate provocation or a spontaneous burst of North Korean militaristic zealotry didn't matter. The world now stood at the edge of a knife. The DMZ went into lockdown, with thousands of troops on both sides scrambling to defensive positions. Fighter jets scrambled from Osan Air Base, and American aircraft carriers rerouted toward the peninsula. Meanwhile, North Korean radio broadcast triumphantly that their soldiers had righteously crushed American imperialists, and Kim Il-sung elevated the attackers to national heroes. Each side braced for the other to strike first. It was at this moment, this insane, claustrophobic, Cold War pressure cooker, that the United States executed one of the most brilliantly calculated shows of force in modern military history. A mission so overwhelming, so ruthlessly theatrical, and so psychologically devastating that it forced North Korea to back down without a single shot being fired. Operation Paul Bunyan, a carefully orchestrated, fully militarized tree-cutting mission involving hundreds of soldiers, dozens of vehicles, special forces, attack helicopters, B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons, fighter escorts, artillery batteries aimed directly at North Korean positions, and the entire U.S. 2nd Infantry Division placed on maximum alert, all to cut down a single tree in full view of the North Korean army. But to understand how this insane spectacle unfolded and why it worked, we first need to understand what happened in the hours immediately after Bonifas and Barrett were killed, because those hours were the most dangerous, the most emotionally charged, and the closest the United States and North Korea had come to open war since 1953. The hours following the axe murders were a spiraling vortex of rage, paranoia, and high-stakes decision-making that pushed the Korean peninsula to the brink of a war nobody wanted, but everyone was preparing for. Because once images of Captain Bonifas's crushed skull and Lieutenant Barrett's mutilated body reached U.S. commanders in Seoul, the emotional fuse was already lit, and the joint security area became a battlefield waiting to explode. Soldiers tightened their grips on rifles, officers shouted to fortify positions, and radio channels that were normally stiff and procedural turned panicked and tense as American and South Korean units scrambled to full alert, knowing that any North Korean movement, any shadow, any misinterpretation could start a firefight that would instantly spiral into a continental war. The South Korean government under Park Chung-hee reacted with ferocity, demanding immediate retaliation and quietly mobilizing military units throughout the country, while the U.S. 8th Army moved artillery into firing positions and activated the Tree Planting Contingency, a bizarrely named but very real crisis protocol for when the DMZ was expected to erupt. Meanwhile, as the victims' bodies were evacuated from Panmunjom, intelligence reports flowed into Seoul at a blistering pace. Intercepted communications from the Korean People's Army indicated North Korean units were fortifying their positions as well, while surveillance imagery showed their guard posts doubling their troop presence, with machine gun nests and RPG crews suddenly appearing on rooftops. The entire DMZ, the most heavily armed strip of land on the planet, had turned into a pressure cooker, each side staring down the other with fingers trembling over triggers. In Washington, the the National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. President Gerald Ford, who had inherited a weakened post-Vietnam military posture and a country exhausted by political scandal, now faced a crisis that demanded strength without recklessness. Intelligence analysts warned that if the U.S. conducted airstrikes or crossed the DMZ, North Korea would almost certainly respond with mass artillery bombardment of Seoul, a city of more than 7 million civilians within immediate range of thousands of North Korean guns. The Joint Chiefs, however, argued that doing nothing would embolden North Korea indefinitely. The U.S. needed to show overwhelming force, but in a way that did not cross the armistice line. "We must respond," Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, "but we must not start a war." The challenge was finding something that would terrify North Korea without escalating into a bloodbath. And then someone suggested a response so symbolic, so theatrical, so precise, that it became the foundation for one of the greatest psychological operations in Cold War history: cut down the tree, but do it with overwhelming military power. Every available force would be mobilized. Every weapon put on display, every unit placed on alert, and it would all be done right in front of the North Koreans, in broad daylight, in the exact location where they murdered 2 unarmed officers. This became the blueprint for Operation Paul Bunyan, a mission that would be executed with choreographed aggression designed to convince Kim Il-sung the United States was ready to go to war at a moment's notice. But before the operation could begin, tensions skyrocketed even further as the search for Lieutenant Barrett's body descended into chaos. Barrett, after being attacked, had fled downhill and disappeared into a trench line, and when the initial American patrols reached the area, they could not find him. This sparked a frantic and dangerous search across the DMZ, with U.S. and ROK soldiers crawling through ditches and mine-covered fields under the watch of armed North Koreans staring down from guard towers. Every minute of this search felt like a countdown to war, and when Barrett's body was finally found nearly 90 minutes later, mutilated, blood-soaked, and partially hidden, the rage among U.S. commanders intensified. His recovery, done under rifles pointed at the rescuers' heads, became a defining emotional trigger for the escalation that followed. Back in Washington, Ford and Kissinger approved the final version of Operation Paul Bunyan. It was simple in concept: send a team to cut down the poplar tree, but do it backed by a display of force so overwhelming that North Korea would be psychologically crushed before they could even think about resisting. In practice, it was one of the most complex non-combat military operations ever attempted. Every branch of the U.S. military in Korea was mobilized. Soldiers were issued live ammunition, something rarely done inside the DMZ. Armored vehicles rolled into staging positions. AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters were ordered to hover over the joint security area as gunships. The U.S. Air Force scrambled B-52 Stratofortresses from Guam, massive nuclear-capable bombers, flying low enough along the DMZ that North Korean observers could clearly identify them, escorted by F-4 Phantom fighters roaring overhead. Artillery units along the entire peninsula were placed on flash alert, meaning they could open fire instantly if anything went wrong. Aircraft carriers in the region shifted to war footing. Even the South Korean Special Forces were deployed in modified uniforms with their faces painted, armed with M16s, grenades, and demolition charges, ready to storm into North Korean territory if the order was given. All of this was to support a chainsaw team cutting a tree. As insane as it sounded, it was one of the most brilliant military messages ever sent. The United States was telling North Korea, "We will finish the mission you tried to stop, and if you interfere again, we will destroy you." Meanwhile, the North Koreans were growing increasingly unstable, unsure of what the Americans were planning. Their intelligence units reported the sudden mobilization of U.S. and ROK forces, but didn't know why such massive firepower was being assembled. Rumors swirled that an American retaliatory strike was imminent. Some North Korean positions even began evacuating non-essential personnel. Kim Il-sung himself reportedly feared the United States was preparing to assassinate him or invade the DMZ. This fear became a crucial psychological factor that would determine the outcome of Operation Paul Bunyan. But before the American convoy rolled into the joint security area for the most heavily armed tree-cutting operation in human history, U.S. generals knew they had to prepare for the worst. Because if even one North Korean soldier fired a shot, even accidentally, the entire peninsula would explode. And that possibility hung like a dark cloud over every American and South Korean soldier gearing up for the mission. At dawn on August 21st, 1976, just 3 days after the murders, the Korean peninsula braced for what could have been the spark of World War III. As Operation Paul Bunyan moved from planning to execution, and U.S. and South Korean forces prepared for the most aggressively choreographed display of military dominance the DMZ had ever seen, all centered on a single poplar tree whose branches had become a symbol of bloodshed, humiliation, and geopolitical posturing. The air that morning was thick with tension, broken only by the mechanical growl of engines, the distant thrum of helicopters, and the quiet, nervous breathing of soldiers who knew that one misinterpreted motion, one nervous finger on a trigger, could ignite a war that would draw in China, the Soviet Union, and potentially unleash nuclear consequences. The convoy rolled out from Camp Bonifas, named in honor of Captain Arthur Bonifas, who had been hacked to death just days earlier, and moved toward the joint security area with an intimidating precision that made even veteran soldiers swallow hard. At the front was a large engineering truck carrying a chainsaw crew trained specifically for this mission, all of them handpicked for their discipline under pressure. Behind them were a group of axe-wielding South Korean Special Forces, the ROK 1st Special Forces Brigade. Men who had sworn they would avenge Bonifas and Barrett with their bare hands if necessary, wearing black-striped face paint and standing rigidly inside the truck with an intensity so sharp it felt like electricity. Behind them rolled armored personnel carriers, jeeps filled with infantry, Humvees packed with extra ammunition, and flatbed trucks loaded with equipment that made it absolutely clear this was not a normal engineering mission. Overhead, AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters swooped low, their cannons and rocket pods aimed directly at North Korean guard towers. Above them, a second layer of UH-1 Huey helicopters hovered with reinforcements ready to rappel down at a moment's notice. High above them, F-4 Phantom jets roared across the sky, and even higher, almost invisible to the naked eye, flew the B-52 Stratofortresses from Guam, accompanied by F-111 fighter bombers, a symbolic reminder that the United States had nuclear capability within striking distance. Along the DMZ, thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, missile launchers, and infantry units were locked into firing positions, each waiting for the order that everyone hoped would never come. Every soldier involved in the operation was operating under a brutal, simple rule. If North Korea fired even a single shot, the United States and South Korea would unleash overwhelming force. Everyone understood this. Everyone braced for it, and North Korea knew it too. As the American convoy approached the tree, North Korean soldiers began emerging from their guard posts in large numbers, first a handful, then dozens, then platoon-sized groups. Many were armed with AK-47s, light machine guns, even RPG launchers. They moved aggressively but hesitated at a distance, clearly startled by the scale of the U.S. ROK deployment. It was said later that one North Korean platoon leader was so overwhelmed by the sight of American firepower that he simply froze, unsure whether he was witnessing the opening phase of an invasion. The atmosphere was so tense that UN soldiers on the ground reported that birds stopped chirping, and every footstep sounded like a gunshot. The chainsaw team stepped out first, a deliberately chosen psychological detail because it signaled to North Korea that the United States had not come for bloodshed, but also that they refused to be intimidated. They walked toward the tree with perfect calm, while the ROK Special Forces positioned themselves around them like an unbreakable wall. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The chainsaw operator pulled the cord. The engine screamed to life, echoing through the DMZ. At that exact second, North Korean soldiers took a step forward. U.S. generals watching from observation posts tensed. Snipers tightened their grips. Helicopter pilots hovered a little lower. Artillery batteries adjusted their angles by a few degrees. The entire peninsula held its breath. But the North Koreans didn't advance further. They froze, and the chainsaw crew continued. The poplar tree, once the source of death and terror, began falling in pieces as the chainsaw tore through its trunk. The psychological warfare was working. The North Koreans were overwhelmed, confronted with firepower they could not match, and aggression they could not challenge. In one of the Joint Security Area towers, a North Korean officer was seen frantically shouting into a field phone, clearly in panic. According to later intelligence analysis, he was begging for orders because no one in Pyongyang had anticipated this level of retaliation. Meanwhile, Iraq Special Forces stood inches from the tree line, glaring at the North Koreans with an intensity so fierce that several DPRK soldiers avoided eye contact entirely. As the minutes passed, the tree came crashing down in a symbolic, thunderous snap. The U.S. had completed the mission that North Korea had violently tried to stop just days earlier. But this time, the North Koreans couldn't do a thing about it. They had been psychologically broken, and the Americans weren't done. After the tree fell, the ROK Special Forces began chopping the remains into smaller pieces, not because it was necessary, but because it was another deliberate act of dominance, a message to North Korea that their earlier violence was meaningless. Meanwhile, U.S. forces maintained their overwhelming formation, guns trained, aircraft circling, artillery locked in, ready to reduce every visible North Korean outpost to rubble if provoked. From their observation posts, North Korean soldiers watched silently, their bravado shattered. They knew that if a shot was fired, they would die instantly. When the operation was complete, the chainsaw crew calmly walked back to the truck, followed by the special forces. The convoy turned around. The helicopters peeled off. The jets roared away. The artillery stood down. And in the most surreal twist of all, the moment the Americans cleared the DMZ, North Korea broadcast something they had never said before: a message of regret. Kim Il-sung personally sent a statement expressing deep regret for the incident, an unimaginable concession from a regime that never apologized. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was the closest thing North Korea had ever made to a diplomatic surrender. Operation Paul Bunyan had worked. The psychological warfare was flawless. War had been avoided, but the consequences of those 3 days would reshape the DMZ forever. Guard rotations changed. Rules of engagement evolved. Both sides became even more paranoid. And the legacy of the axe murder incident would linger as a reminder that even the smallest miscalculation, a tree branch, a loud order, a misunderstood gesture, could bring the world to the edge of disaster. In the aftermath of Operation Paul Bunyan, as the sound of chainsaws faded, the jets disappeared beyond the horizon, and artillery units slowly powered down across the peninsula. The Korean DMZ entered one of the strangest and tensest calm periods in its history, a silence layered with shock, humiliation, diplomatic scrambling, and a deep, almost grudging respect for the sheer scale of the operation the United States had just executed. Because what Washington had accomplished in those 42 minutes was unlike anything North Korea had ever witnessed. A bloodless demonstration of overwhelming force so psychologically crushing that Kim Il-sung himself realized the consequences of further escalation would be national suicide. But while the world breathed a sigh of relief, intelligence analysts across the globe began dissecting what the incident truly meant, about North Korea's leadership, about U.S. resolve, and about the terrifying fragility of peace in a region where one tree had nearly triggered a nuclear standoff. Inside Pyongyang, the fallout was immediate and chaotic. Kim Il-sung summoned emergency meetings with the Korean People's Army's top commanders, demanding explanations for why his forces had provoked an incident that nearly pushed the country to war. Reports suggest shouting matches, panicked internal memos, and even quiet purges of officers deemed overly aggressive or politically unreliable. The regime's propaganda arm scrambled to rewrite the narrative, claiming that North Korea had diplomatically de-escalated the situation, though privately, the leadership was stunned by how quickly the United States mobilized overwhelming force. Some North Korean generals, who initially believed the U.S. was too politically fractured after Vietnam and Watergate to respond decisively, now found themselves terrified. Several intelligence assessments indicate they feared that a single misstep could bring B-52 bombers circling overhead back for a far deadlier visit. Meanwhile, South Korea watched the aftermath through a lens of grim satisfaction and renewed resolve. President Park Chung-hee used the incident to push for a stronger military posture, arguing that North Korea only respected force, not diplomacy. Anti-North sentiment surged across the South Korean public, and many young men enlisted with heightened patriotism. The ROK Special Forces who took part in Operation Paul Bunyan became quiet legends within military circles, their presence at the front line of the standoff turning them into symbols of national pride and defiance. But the United States had different concerns. In Washington, the incident raised a troubling question. How could something as trivial as a tree-trimming operation nearly trigger a war? The National Security Council and Joint Chiefs conducted internal reviews of DMZ protocols, concluding that even minor field operations needed deeper intelligence coordination, clearer lines of communication, and contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. This analysis reshaped UN command procedures, leading to stricter oversight of operations inside the Joint Security Area and a greater emphasis on avoiding close-quarters confrontations with North Korean forces. The psychological dimension of the crisis also became a major intelligence takeaway. Analysts noted how North Korea's behavior revealed a volatile mix of hyper-nationalism, rigid military doctrine, and deep insecurity. The violence was not simply an act of aggression. It was an emotional explosion triggered by perceived disrespect, by the belief that any U.S. action inside the JSA threatened the regime's prestige. This realization informed future U.S. policy. In dealing with North Korea, symbolic gestures mattered just as much as military capabilities. At the same time, Operation Paul Bunyan sent a message across the communist world. In Beijing, Chinese leaders monitored the crisis with cautious anxiety. China had no desire for a second Korean War, especially one that might draw in the Soviet Union and destabilize East Asia. The U.S. show of force impressed Beijing, even as it unsettled them. Chinese military intelligence concluded that Washington still possessed the political will and operational capability to act decisively in Asia, countering earlier assumptions that post-Vietnam America had weakened. In Moscow, the aftermath was analyzed through Cold War strategic lenses. Soviet analysts noted that the United States had demonstrated a model for conventional escalation that avoided nuclear confrontation. They were also surprised by North Korea's recklessness, worried that Kim Il-sung's impulsiveness could drag the Soviet Union into a conflict it didn't want. Behind closed doors, Soviet officials quietly urged Pyongyang to avoid future provocations that might risk sparking a war neither superpower could control. Back at the DMZ, the physical landscape of the Joint Security Area changed dramatically. The poplar tree, once a towering symbol of contested authority, was now a stump, a reminder of how close the world had come to disaster. UN Command built new guard posts, restructured patrol paths, and redesigned portions of the JSA to reduce face-to-face interactions with North Korean soldiers. The infamous Bridge of No Return, located just meters from where the murders occurred, was closed permanently to prevent another flashpoint confrontation. The axe murder incident also altered how soldiers from both sides viewed each other. For the South Koreans and Americans, North Korean troops became symbols of unpredictability, capable of erupting into violence over nothing. For the North Koreans, U.S. and ROK forces were seen not as weak post-Vietnam adversaries, but as militaries capable of unleashing unimaginable destruction at a moment's notice. The mutual distrust hardened, calcifying into the tense, theatrical hostility that defines the DMZ to this day. Over time, the incident became a case study in military academies around the world. Generals lectured about it as an example of emotional escalation, strategic signaling, psychological warfare, and crisis management under nuclear shadow. Intelligence courses examined the incident for its deeper implications: how regimes perceive threats, how symbolism shapes conflict, and how a single misinterpreted action can trigger a geopolitical chain reaction. The Pentagon quietly incorporated lessons from the incident into war planning, integrating psychological displays of force into future doctrines. Operation Paul Bunyan became the gold standard for demonstration operations, shows of strength designed to avoid combat through intimidation. But while policymakers analyzed the broader implications, the families of Captain Bonifas and Lieutenant Barrett were left with the raw tragedy. 2 men murdered brutally, far from home, because of a political line drawn across a divided peninsula. Their names became etched into DMZ history, and their deaths became a solemn reminder of how fragile peace truly was. Yet, ironically, the very brutality of their deaths helped prevent a second Korean War. It was their sacrifice that forced the U.S. to stand firm, their murder that fueled the resolve behind Operation Paul Bunyan, and their legacy that influenced future crisis responses. In the years that followed, North Korea repeatedly cited the axe murder incident in its propaganda, portraying the attackers as patriotic heroes who defended Korean sovereignty. But internally, the regime remained deeply wary of provoking a similar U.S. response. Intelligence intercepts revealed that North Korean commanders were instructed to avoid any confrontations in the JSA that could escalate uncontrollably. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that while North Korea celebrated the incident publicly, The reality behind closed doors was humiliation and fear. And as decades passed, the story faded from mainstream memory, overshadowed by nuclear tests, missile launches, and political theatrics. But for those who study the Cold War, the axe murder incident remains one of the most important examples of how dangerously fragile stability can be, and how a crisis that begins with axes and a tree can end with B-52 bombers circling overhead, waiting for a command that could change the world forever. In the years that followed the axe murder incident and Operation Paul Bunyan, the event evolved from an acute crisis into a long-term strategic touchstone, a moment that intelligence analysts, military planners, and diplomats continually revisited to understand the unpredictable psychology of North Korea and the delicate choreography required to prevent catastrophic escalation on the Korean Peninsula. Because while the world moved on to other Cold War flashpoints, Afghanistan, Euro missiles, the Iran-Contra affair, the lessons of that single poplar tree continued to ripple through policy decisions, military doctrine, and the day-to-day reality of serving inside the DMZ. It became a symbol of how a trivial dispute could nearly trigger nuclear war, and how a carefully calibrated show of overwhelming force could restore deterrence without firing a shot. Within the U.S. military, Operation Paul Bunyan was studied as a masterclass in controlled escalation, demonstrating the perfect balance between power and restraint. Defense analysts marveled at how the U.S. mobilized thousands of troops, nuclear-capable bombers, helicopter gunships, and special forces not to launch an attack, but to send a message, one that Kim Il-sung clearly understood. The operation proved that in crises involving unpredictable adversaries, the perception of strength could matter more than violence itself, and this understanding influenced U.S. strategy for decades. Future American presidents, from Reagan to Clinton to Bush, often invoked the axe murder incident when confronted with North Korean provocations, recognizing that Pyongyang responded not to appeasement or economic incentives, but to unmistakable demonstrations of resolve. South Korea internalized these lessons even more deeply. The ROK Army increased its training intensity, expanded its special forces programs, and embraced a doctrine of aggressive deterrence, ensuring that any future North Korean assault would be met with swift and overwhelming retribution. The memory of Bonifas and Barrett became integral to South Korean military culture, a reminder that peace could only be preserved through vigilance, readiness, and sacrifice. Meanwhile, North Korea's own reaction, though masked by layers of propaganda, was one of profound recalibration. Many within the regime reportedly viewed the U.S. response as a wake-up call, a demonstration that despite its post-Vietnam introspection, America was still fully capable of projecting power across the world with brutal efficiency. Intelligence intercepted years later revealed that Kim Il-sung privately reprimanded the officers involved in the initial attack, not because they killed Americans, but because their impulsive brutality nearly invited a war that North Korea was not prepared to fight. The regime began tightening its command structure within the DMZ, centralizing control to reduce the likelihood of uncontrolled outbursts from low-ranking soldiers. Even decades later, when Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un inherited the leadership, internal memos emphasized the need to avoid large-scale confrontations in the joint security area unless explicitly ordered, an echo of 1976 that shaped tactical rules of engagement. Internationally, Operation Paul Bunyan reshaped how the world viewed the Korean Peninsula. Allied nations praised the U.S. for its restraint coupled with decisive action, while adversaries, particularly Beijing and Moscow, took note of Washington's ability to respond with crushing force even when politically weakened. In China, the incident became a cautionary tale. Although China supported North Korea as a buffer state, it did not want a war that could bring U.S. forces to its doorstep. Chinese military planners studied the event to understand American crisis behavior, concluding that while the U.S. disliked war, it would fight ferociously if forced. In the Soviet Union, the incident highlighted the dangers of proxy states acting unpredictably. Moscow grew frustrated with Pyongyang's uncontrollable behavior and quietly urged North Korea to avoid further provocations that could entangle the USSR in a war it did not want. As the Cold War progressed, the axe murder incident became a blueprint for handling future flashpoints. Episodes like the 2010 Cheonan sinking, the 2015 DMZ landmine attack, and numerous missile tests were all interpreted through the lens of 1976. Analysts asked the same question each time. Would North Korea back down when confronted with overwhelming strength, as it had after Operation Paul Bunyan? Often, the answer was yes. But the lingering danger remained. North Korea's leadership was prone to emotional decision-making, propaganda-fueled nationalism, and internal political pressures that could erupt into violence without warning. The DMZ itself changed after the incident, becoming even more fortified and more rigidly controlled. Additional barriers, electrified fences, and surveillance systems were installed. Overwatch towers gained heavier armaments. Patrols doubled. The once shared spaces of the Joint Security Area were divided, limiting interactions between UN and North Korean personnel. Soldiers who once patrolled close enough to exchange insults or smuggle notes were pushed apart physically and psychologically. Even small details, like the positioning of observation posts and the design of the blue conference buildings, were influenced by the lessons of 1976. The Bridge of No Return, where prisoner of war exchanges once took place, was permanently closed after the murders of Bonifas and Barrett, symbolizing a shift from fragile coexistence to hardened division. And yet, despite the heightened security, soldiers continued to serve within eyesight of the enemy, maintaining a fragile peace with the constant awareness that history had nearly repeated itself countless times. The families of the victims remained a quiet but solemn part of the story. Over the years, ceremonies were held at Camp Bonifas, where a plaque and a stone monument stand to honor the two officers. Veterans who served during the incident often returned, some haunted by what they saw, others proud of the role they played in preventing what could have been the deadliest conflict since World War II. Their testimonies became a living record of the day the world held its breath. In the broader arc of Cold War history, the axe murder incident stands as a stark reminder of how easily peace can collapse, and how even a superpower must walk a tightrope between demonstrating strength and avoiding catastrophe. It is a story of brutality met with overwhelming force, of psychological warfare wielded with surgical precision, and of the constant, terrifying truth that borders defined by war never truly stop being battlegrounds. Today, the legacy of that moment lives on in the caution and choreography that define U.S.-North Korean relations. Modern tensions, missile tests, nuclear threats, diplomatic breakdowns are all shaped by memories of the day when the world nearly exploded over a tree. The axe murder incident remains an enduring warning. In places like the DMZ, the smallest spark can ignite the largest fire, and the difference between peace and war can come down to a single order, a single gesture, or a single moment of madness.